It's very lovely to be here on such a wonderful sunny day. I'm very excited for lunchtime and going wandering around in the sunshine. So this is the slide where I awkwardly introduce myself. Phil already did a wonderful job of that, but I'm Cassie and this is my website. So I really enjoyed seeing little snippets from the early web in Jeremy's talk. I've got a real soft spot for the earlier days of the web, maybe not that early, but the earlier days of the web when things were a little bit messy and a little bit more creative and a little less corporate. Obviously, in hindsight, it's always nicer to kind of look back in hindsight and not at the time when you're battling with like clear fixes and border images and stuff. But the sparkly cursors and stuff were fun. I actually had a little side hustle at school because I was a bit of a chubby kid and my parents refused to give me money for the tuck shop. So I started modding people's Neopets pages and GeoCities pages in exchange for donuts. And my parents were like, why is she still so porky? So yeah, who had a GeoCities site? Few people. Who had Neopets? MySpace? Okay, cool. Enough people. So yeah, I'm still quite determined to keep that vibe alive in the web that we find ourselves in nowadays. Luckily for me, it's quite easy to do this now because I work for an animation library called GreenSock. So I get to teach and help enable people to make all sorts of silly nonsense over the web. And this could be anything from, interface animations, all the way through to like games and big interactive WebGL things. So it just makes me endlessly happy to exist in this corner of the internet where people are kind of making really fun things and experimenting. And I say little corner of the internet, GSAP is just 3 people, so it definitely feels like a privilege to be part of that. I myself have a soft spot for tinkering around with SVG, stuff like this little text animation, this little wobbly jellyfish that I made with SVG filters. This is a displacement filter, kind of makes it look like it's wobbling around. And this swooshy thing, I don't know, swooshy. Very bad for performance, but very fun. Like, I wouldn't put this on a live site. It's actually just a video because if this was the code pen, my laptop would probably heat up too much. So I also get to do SVG animation for work sometimes, which is super fun, not just wobbly jellyfish. And my favorite thing to do is sprinkling little animations like this on sites that are speedy and accessible and performant. So that's my jam, is kind of joyful progressive enhancements on top of like lovely little 11T sites. It's my favorite. So yeah, this is Vitaly's new UX blog, by the way, if you want to check that out, if you're into UX design articles. So yeah, I've done a lot of SVG talks in the past and workshops, but it's not a hugely common corporate ask to animate some noodles. So this time, I'm going to break out of my SVG box and we're going to talk about a more common type of web animation, which is namely moving little rectangles around a screen. Animating the impossible. I've tried to make this sound more exciting by calling the talk Animating the Impossible and not just moving some little boxes around a screen. Get the bums on seats. But now you're here, what we're actually going to be covering is animating rectangles, but some really tricky rectangle stuff involving responsive layouts, DOM restructuring, and different position properties without causing layout reflows. Welcome. Fun. Are you all excited? I'm sorry. I feel like I tricked everyone. So what makes an impossible animation? So if we look at traditional animation techniques, in order to animate between different states would have to do different drawings or frames. And it would be up to the animator to kind of painstakingly draw out each individual position, each intermediate frame to create the illusion of movement. So this was referred to as in-betweening. So this is basically the stuff in between. And now we have the same deal, but the computer basically does the hard work for us. Yay! So in GSAP world, we call this tweening. And this is a little GSAP tween, and we're just animating this ball element up and down like a yo-yo. And all we have to do, whether we're using CSS or GSAP, is just define a start and an end value, and then the technology interpolates between those values for us. We could do a little bit more work, so we could add in some keyframes. Similar to kind of CSS, you can add in keyframes to kind of define more in-between states. We can do that with GSAP as well, with keyframes or with timelines. So yeah, this is where we start getting into impossibilities though. So when we're animating CSS properties, some are animatable properties, which is a weird word to say, and some aren't. So a CSS property is only animatable if its value can be changed over time. So basically, in order to animate between two different things, you need the values all the way in between those two things to be valid syntax the entire way through the animation. So this is a really common impossible animation that a lot of people run into when they first start kind of animating on the web. Here, this is the possible one. Wait, let's do that again. I'm pretending to live code, but I'm not. Their videos. Sneaky. So if we've got pixel values, we can go from height 20 pixels to height 260 pixels. Really nice and easy because all of the states in between are valid. As soon as we go, oh, but we want auto height because we don't know how much content's going to be in that container, the browser's like, no, sorry, I don't understand that. You can't animate from a keyword property to a pixel value. There's no intermediary states in between that. So another similar one that I see a lot in the GSAP forums with newbies is they're like, oh, I'm trying to fade between these two different background images. And they're trying to animate between a background image and another background image. But a background image is either there or it isn't. It's a binary thing. You can't animate between two background images because there's no magic state in the middle that's like a mixture of the two. So a large part of what we do at GSAP is kind of making the impossible possible. So we work out ways to animate between these things that you shouldn't be able to animate between and kind of plugging the gaps when there's cross-browser issues. So one of the little things is if you're using a GSAP tween, you can say animate to or from height auto, even though it's impossible. And you know, magic, but it's not really magic. We're just kind of grabbing the height with JavaScript. Like we were saying earlier, when you can't do something with CSS, it's a good place for kind of JavaScript to take over. So we're grabbing the height with JavaScript and then using that in the tween. So that's like a little magic trick underneath our belts. But UI animation gets a lot more tangly. The web is quite a complicated place to animate. And I really like this quote from Miriam Suzanne. She said, the web is an infinite and unknowable canvas. I don't know where this quote was from, whether it was from a talk that she did or just in the pub afterwards. I've tried to find it existing in the world. I think she's just very knowledgeable and she just gives off good quotes constantly. But yeah, the web's an infinite and unknowable canvas. We don't usually have consistent units and easy values to animate between. So there's tons of all sorts of different units. We've got pixels and ems and rems, and we've now got container units and different viewport units as well. We've got all sorts of different devices. So we've got iPads and phones and laptops and those new silly phones that fold in the middle. And elements can be fixed or relative or absolute or sticky. We've got flexbox and grid and floats and inline and all the things, all of the things. And because of this, UI animating can get really fiddly. With SVGs, when you're animating SVGs, they just exist in this little SVG world, and you can just move bits of them around completely independently, and you don't have to worry about layout and what's happening to the rest of your website. So yeah, often when people come to my SVG workshops, they're like, yeah, but how do I do this on like an actual website now? And sometimes it can just get avoided entirely. And it's a huge shame because animation can be a really integral part of understanding an interface. So yeah, why is it so important? This is the sounds hard, why bother point of the talk, which is a good question. So I will answer it in a bit, but first I'm going to have a little break from talking and we're going to watch a little video together as a treat.
Hi, I'm Richard, this is Sarah, and we're going to perform the amazing colour-changing card trick with this blue-backed deck of cards. Now, the idea is very simple. I'm just going to spread the cards in front of Sarah and ask her to push any card towards the camera.
Right, okay, let's see. I'm going to go for this card here.
Okay. Now, Sarah could have selected any card at all from the deck, but she selected the card which is now face down on the table. And what I'm going to ask her to do is show us which card she selected.
Right, so the card that I chose was in fact the 3 of diamonds.
The 3 of diamonds, okay, an excellent choice. That card goes back into the deck. Now I'm just going to spread the cards face up on the table. Do a little click of the fingers, and you'll see that Sarah's card here has now got a blue back. Not particularly surprising. What's slightly more surprising is all of the other cards have got red backs. And that is the amazing colour-changing card trick.
Who spotted the changes? Who won? Yeah, okay, awesome. I think this one, who's seen the gorilla one before? Yeah, I almost got Phil to dress up as a gorilla and just do some running around. But yeah, I thought this one was a good, it's so sneaky. It's so mad how it gets to the end of it. And there's always like a groan, an audible groan in the audience. So Richard Wiseman is really great. He's one of my favorite authors, people in general. He's a psychologist and a magician, and he's written a bunch of books, unsurprisingly, on the psychology behind why we believe certain things, like believe in the supernatural or get fooled by magic tricks. And when I was kind of researching this talk, I realized there was a decent overlap between some UX research I'd read about and the psychology of magic in one of his books. So visual awareness is a thing that's covered a lot by the Nielsen-Norman group, who do a lot of really great UX studies, and Richard Wiseman. And basically, we're just all a lot less observant than we like to think we are. So in the back of our eyes, it always looks a little bit like the Illuminati, and I really didn't intend for this to give off culty vibes. But anyway, so in the back of our eyes, we have 2 types of light-sensitive cells. So we've got cones and rods. So the cones are the little triangle fellas, and the rods are the little rod-shaped things. And the cones are more sensitive to light and movement, and to light and color, and rods are more sensitive to movement. So we have more rods in our peripheral vision and more cones in our central vision. And our peripheral vision is basically just shouting like, hey, over here, there's something over here you should look at. And then our central vision is scanning into that place and kind of absorbing more information. And apparently way more neurons analyze the stuff that's picked up by our central vision as well. Whereas our peripheral vision, it's kind of full of gaps, and our brain just tries to fill in the gaps as much as possible. It's like, well, we've kind of been in a room that looks like this before, so I'll just assume that that's happening. And I know what a tree looks like, so I'll just kind of fill in those gaps. And this is called inattentional blindness, and magicians take advantage of this to kind of do sneaky things in our peripheral vision while our attention is elsewhere. But this brain quirk can lead to frustration with website interfaces. If something unexpected gets added into the DOM or changed or shuffled around without you realizing, it can often be missed, and it can lead to users getting frustrated, not being able to complete tasks, not understanding where things have moved to. I don't know whether anyone had to help elderly relatives with online shopping during COVID. It's a hard process. My mum really struggled with it, and I found little animations like this online, and I was like, oh, you know, if there was like something going into the basket moving in some way, then I think she would have found it a lot easier to understand where her like physical shopping basket was in the digital world. Another really annoying one is like when you're filling in a form, and I'm sure everyone's filled in a form, and you get to the end and you hit submit, and it's like, no, not allowed. And you have to scroll all the way up to try and find out where the little red error state is. Red might not even be the right color for the error state. But if there was some sort of animation at the time that moved, you'd get your attention diverted, and you'd realize that you have to carry on filling it in. So animation can be incredibly useful, especially with complex interfaces that people are using for like work or admin purposes. So yes, let's break down some UI transitions. So I like to think of UI transitions as fitting into one of these three categories. We've got exit animations, those things that are leaving the DOM. We've got entrance animations, these are things that are being added. And then there's persistent animations. And these are things that might be moving from one place to another. But since we're on a whole magic vibe, we will have vanishing and appearing and levitating. I'm really trying to make this exciting for you. So yeah, enough slides, so we'll make something vanish. So we're going to make this little card move from one hand to the other and disappear. And we were talking about different units before. So we can move it to the other side of the screen with viewport widths, and we can make it vanish with opacity 0. So Ira was talking about different ways that we can kind of make elements disappear. And we make things disappear all the time as developers with opacity 0 or with visibility hidden. Auto alpha in GSAP's world is opacity and visibility hidden. So then it's hidden for screen readers as well. But if you wanted to get rid of it completely, we've got like on complete callbacks, so you could animate it, and then on complete, you could pull that element out of the DOM. So that's kind of making something disappear in a variety of different ways. It's less exciting than when a magician makes something disappear, isn't it? So we'll do the same thing. We'll make something appear. Again, less exciting. I don't have like a rabbit or anything. So we're going to do the same thing again. We're going to say we've got a card, and we want it to be hidden to start off with, and then we're going to animate it over to the other hand. Oh, we're trying out some different values. Trying to remember what past Cassie was doing when I was coding. So I'm doing window and a width this time instead of viewport widths, just to kind of show that we could do that. So we've animated it from its original position over to its new position. But you'll see if we resize the screen, it's not actually in that place in the DOM. We've got it in a transformed position. So then if you were to resize the browser, everything's going to go a bit wonky. So that's not really what we want. We could take advantage of the fact that browsers are clever, and we could use left 100% if we've got an absolutely positioned element. There's a few people that have pulled some faces there. And that's very true because we don't want to be animating certain properties. So the first way that we were animating, we were actually using transforms. We don't really want to be animating position like top and left because it's quite bad for the browser. So we don't have to just worry about what properties we can animate on the web. We've also got to think about which values we're animating and how they're impacting performance. So yeah, let's talk about browsers. So after your HTML and CSS and JavaScript is all processed, the browser goes through 3 steps to kind of get all of the lovely pixels onto the screen. So the first step is layout. This is when the browser calculates where everything needs to be, where we're going to put all of our rectangles. You don't see this bit happening. This is just the browser thinking about stuff. And then after that, the pixels all get painted onto layers. And then finally, those layers get popped on top of each other to create the website. So animation-wise, you might have heard that it's better to animate transforms and opacity. And the reason it's better to animate transforms and opacity is because those are in the final composite stage. So if we change a property like transform or opacity, the browser only has to deal with the composite bit. If we animate something like left or top or width, the browser has to reflow the whole page. It has to go through all of those steps again. So first we have to recalculate all the layout, and then we've got to do all the painting of all the pixels, and then we've got to do composite. If you're doing just one change, that's fine, right? But if you're animating something for 10 seconds, like 60 times a second or whatever, the browser's like chugging through all of these steps, trying to keep up. And that's why your laptop will go really, really hot. It look like it's going to take off. So if we animate stuff like background color, we're hitting the paint step, so we don't trigger layout, but it's still quite expensive for the browser to figure out. Transforms and opacity, just the final composite stage. So that's how you get buttery smooth animations. So, right, how do we animate something into its position in the DOM without using layout properties? So the trick is to start by putting the element in its final position. And then we can use animation to animate it from a transformed position into the place that it's actually meant to be in. So we can do the same thing again. We want to animate from this hand into this hand. Ta-da! But we're using a from tween this time. Rather than animating to a position, we're animating from a position. And now this is just a tiny detail, and you might be sitting there going, this is not very exciting. This seems quite obvious, but it's the setup for our big magic trick. So it's good that you kind of understand this. So yeah, here's another one. We've got a card that's position relative, and this is hanging out in a flex container. And we want to make it fixed position and full height. So this is another thing that a lot of people will try and do. They'll just try and add a transition. So change to position fixed in JavaScript and then add a little CSS transition. But this doesn't work because we're trying to animate between 2 keyword values. It's position fixed and position relative. They've got completely different rules about how the element behaves, and we can't animate in between those states. So if we add a transition, the element just jumps out of the document flow, pops back into the document flow, and then kind of tries its best to animate. Like it's really trying. It kind of does this little jump, but we can't control this at all. And we can't change the transform origin at all to kind of make it any easier. So how do we animate impossible challenges like this? So with a little bit of magic, it's an animation technique that is a little bit like browser sleight of hand. So when the animation starts, we have to make it look like the element hasn't moved at all, when actually it's in a completely different place. So we're going to do this browser magic with flip. Who's heard of flip before? That's awesome. Okay, cool. So flip's an animation technique that's been around for a really long time now, but I often see a lot of people battling with animations that could be solved really easily by approaching it with the flip technique. So Paul Lewis from Google was the first one to coin the phrase. Jake Archibald is still grumpy about the fact that he's got a famous phrase and he doesn't. David Corsid and Sarah Drasner have written about it too. And it's a handy little mnemonic that stands for first, last, invert, and play. So take a little look at how this works. So the first thing that we're going to do is grab the position and size of the element with get bounding client rect. So rectangles again, hooray. So we're just grabbing the top and left and height and width and get it back in a nice little object. And this gives us the positions relative to the viewport. And then last, we're going to move the element to its new position in the DOM. And we're going to do these calculations again. So we're going to grab the top left, width and height. And this is the sneaky bit. This is happening in the layout stage. So this is happening when the browser's calculating stuff, but it isn't actually painted onto the screen yet. So you can't actually see that the element is in its new position. It's just kind of happening behind the scenes in the browser. I should have been on this slide. Magic is happening in between the layout and paint steps. So it's a little bit of browser sleight of hand. And then when we know where our first and last positions are, we put the element back in its original position, but using transforms. So to the user, when they click to move the element, it just looks like nothing's happened, but it's actually been moved and calculated and then moved back again with transforms. And then finally, we can play by removing the transforms, removing the offsets, and then animating the removal of those offsets. So wall of code time, which is really fun for all of you at the back, sorry. This is what a simple flip looks like in vanilla JS. So same thing again, get the bounding client rect first position, switch it up however you want in the DOM, get the last position, calculate the delta offsets, and then we can animate it. So this is just using CSS. We've also got a flip plugin at GSAP that kind of does this for you. So you can just say get state, then do your DOM scripting, and then animate from the state. It also works around a lot of things that are a little bit tricky with the flip technique. So quirks with like nested transforms, grid and flex containers, that kind of thing. So yeah, let's look at it in action. Again, I know it's hard to see the screen for everyone at the back, but I've got the slides available online, and these are all videos rather than like live coding. So if you wanted to watch through them, you can. So yeah, we're just adding a flip animation, and that's animating now from position relative in a flex container to position fixed. You can even add a little spin. I don't know why you'd want to add a spin. I've never actually added a spin on any flip animations, but it's fun that you can. And that's just the normal GSAP tween as well. So you can kind of add easing or pop it into a timeline or anything else. Cool, so that's hard, but we can do more impossible. We're gonna step it up a little bit. So reparenting, we've got two divs now. So we've got one for the left hand and one for the right. And we can see that we've got the card in the left hand at the moment and the right hand is empty. And we're actually going to reparent that card out of the left hand and pop it into the new position in the DOM. So we've just got a little bit of JavaScript down here that's reparenting the card. And we're getting the state of the card, reparenting it, and then we're doing a little flip animation. So that's actually moving to a new position in the DOM. And now this is the really cool thing. So if you can see the screen, this is when it kind of clicked for me. If you pause it, so we're going to pause the animation, and this is just going to do the technical bit behind the flip. So you can see here that the card is in the left hand, and the right hand is empty. And if we click on it, it's not going to animate, but you'll see that the DOM's changed. And if we go take a look in the DOM, it's not in the left div anymore, it's in the right one. And you can see that it's got a whole bunch of transforms applied to move it to the same position. And it's a little bit confusing to get your head around because technically it's already kind of moved to a new place, but you don't actually see it happen. So that's all well and good, but frameworks hate moving stuff around. What they really love doing is like re-rendering an entire new DOM every time. So you don't just get to like move things around nicely and have loads of control over where your elements are going to end up. So in order to get around that, we've got some data flip IDs. And you can add like a little ID onto any HTML that you're injecting and anything that is leaving that you want to be joined together. And it's basically just saying like, remember me, we're gonna like nuke this whole DOM and we're gonna render a whole new one, but just remember that these had some sort of relationship. And then we can pass in targets. So we pass in the class of the card that's incoming and outgoing. And then if we do a little click, ta-da! So that's deleting the element entirely and then re-rendering an entirely new element. And it still works. I don't know what I was inspecting here. I think you've all got the idea. But yeah, that feels very impossible to me. And it still makes me really excited when I do it. I do use the flip technique all the time now, but every time I do it, I'm like, oh, this shouldn't be possible. Shouldn't be possible. So yeah, let's do even more impossible. So the last one we had adding and deleting, but they were sharing state. So they were persistent animations. Like they were there in one place and then they were there in another place. But what if we actually want to shuffle things around, but also add new things and delete things? So at the moment, we've got these cards. If we click on them, you can see, let's do that again. We've got these cards. If we click on the mat, then they're going to shuffle. So they're switching up kind of like the cards we're doing before. If we click on the crystal ball, then we're going to add a new card. And if you click on one of the cards, we're going to delete that card. And you can see it's a little bit janky now. Like we click to delete it, and then everything kind of like jerks. It's like, oh, I'm not quite sure where my new positioning is meant to be because the DOM's changed. And this is quite a common difficulty because animating something's removal from the DOM, if you just go, you take it out of the DOM, there's nothing to animate, it doesn't exist anymore. There's no end state. So what we've got is we've got some little callbacks. We've got an on-enter and an on-leave. So on-enter basically looks for anything that wasn't there in the initial state grab, but is there in the second state grab, and then it passes it through to that callback, and then you can animate that in any way that you want. So this, we're gonna just animate it so it slides up from the bottom. So you can just slide in new cards like that. And then those new cards are included into the flip state for the next animation as well. And then we can do the same thing with on leave. So on leave basically looks for any elements that have been that have had display none visibility hidden added, and then passes them through to the on leave function. And then you can animate them however you want, but you can also add another little callback to remove them from the DOM if you want. So yeah, now we can click on the little cards and we can add them and remove them, and they do a little spin. And they're all kind of included in the same little state animation. So yeah, that's enter and exit animations. So I know I said the whole purpose of Flip is to avoid layout reflows, but it's also worth noting that it depends. Catchphrase of the day. And sometimes you either have to push back on the designer that wants a certain thing, or you have to break the rules. So this demo, for example, it's got a border radius, and border radius just doesn't scale nicely. You're going to have to animate width or height if you've got a border radius, or you're going to have to do some crazy masking. Scaling can also mess up text reflow as well. So sometimes you might have to animate height instead, or again, do some masking. So I always say for this kind of thing, it depends. I've successfully animated height or width or scale height or width instead of scale on quite a few things, but you just have to look at the size of the area that you're animating, the duration of the animation, how important it is. So yeah, just be aware and make sure you test on lower end devices if you're starting to think that you might have to animate something that isn't a composite property. So there's also in this demo some nested elements which are kind of whizzing all over the place. And that's because we've got a flip animation happening on a parent and a flip animation happening on a child. So this is technically a flip-flop and not just a flip. So you have to do first, last, invert, play on the parent, and then on the child, you do first, last, and then measure the offset from the parent and take that into account. So if you're using the flip plugin, you don't have to worry about that. But if you're doing like a vanilla JS approach, you just have to take that into account. So yeah, that is the flip technique, which is, in my opinion, the most magical animation technique out there, even if it is largely for moving boxes around. And there's a lot of examples of the flip technique out there, and most of them tend to be for big swipey layout things like moving around grids, but it's actually really useful just as a kind of tool to have in your animation tool set. So I did this little animation for ESLint a while back, and at first it just looked like a really nice simple timeline. It was like, type in the text, and then there's a little box that pops up, and then you click the box and the text changes. But the little cursor was a tricky one because the text in that section was coming from a CMS and it might have changed. They also had internationalization, so the text was changing on depending on what country you're in. Also responsive stuff, so you never really knew where that little pop-up box was going to be at any time. So I did a little flip animation from a position absolute cursor up at the top right-hand corner, and then another position absolute cursor down on the box, and then just flip between them. And that means that it's always kind of going to the right place, no matter what the text looks like. So yeah, there's occasions for flip animations everywhere. This is kind of a more common use for flip animations, like little grids. This was by Ryan Mulligan. I really like the little trolley in the corner with the little bounce. Very cute. And also, there's super exciting native flippy things coming almost here, like in Chrome. They're in Chrome. And they're currently being worked on as a draft spec. So this is the rework of the Reparenting demo that I showed you, but it's just using the View Transitions API. So if you're interested in this, Jake Archibald's been talking about it loads, and he's got a couple of really good videos. But underneath the hood, it's using the same trick. It's just abstracted away even more and looks even more magical. So here's some code. Basically, there's a little fallback for browsers that don't support the API. So you could kind of use it as a progressive enhancement. And then you just say start view transition, and that's initiating the view transition, and you pass in your data, and then you just do your restructuring. So that's the only bit, really. That's just telling the browser that you're going to do a view transition. Yeah, so in the CSS, we've given the card a view transition name of cards, so it gets treated independently from the rest of the DOM. And then there's a transition, a CSS transition on the pseudo element group that's containing what I thought was just old and new snapshots of the state. But this morning, too soon for me to adjust the talk, I saw a demo online of a view transition that had a video element in it. And the view transition was happening and the video was continuing to play the entire way through the view transition. So my mind was a little bit blown, and I now have no idea how this is working underneath the hood. It's like dark browser magic. So yeah, take a little look at view transitions because I think they're going to be very useful. And I'll leave you with a last little message. I hope you find this technique useful for animation in the future, but remember to use your animation superpowers responsibly. So big swipey layout shifts can be very nauseating for some people with vestibular disorders. And it's not just like a thing that some people have and some people don't. I had migraines for a little while because of some medication I was on, and I couldn't look at any animation, which was not particularly great for my job. But yeah, if an animation is an integral part of explaining UI, in some way provide a subtle opacity fallback. And if it's decorative, you can just disable it. It's totally fine. And that's the lot. Thank you very much.